today's seminar, I thought it would be interesting to reflect a little bit on what metrics do we need to assess environmental sustainability of livestock husbandry, and then to show you what were the reflections that were going into work package 6. So to start with, as an introduction, I copied the objective of the Pathways project on its own, because I think it's interesting. And it starts with pathways for transition to sustainability in livestock husbandry and food systems. And I want to just mention here, well, livestock is part of a food system, and I'm going to use these two concepts together always, because I think addressing problems in food systems includes looking at livestock. And we also see that we aim at reducing environmental impacts, addressing social demand, and the safe and nutritious and affordable meat and dairy products. So we have a multidimensional problem. Today, I want to reflect what metrics are needed for the environmental sustainability of livestock husbandry in the food systems, and help us or motivate a bit better what we try to do in work package 6 on the territorial approaches. Let me see. So if I can move, yeah. So I took this graphic, which has been from the European Union, adapted from the FAO, which describes what is a sustainable food system. And we all know this graphic, where we look at the environment, the social, and the economic part of a system. Pathways addresses this holistic approach, mainly, for example, through the PG tool in work package 2. Today, we want to focus only on one part, and it's the environmental sustainability, acknowledging that we are not looking at the other dimensions. And the question we want to ask here is, what are the strategies to an environmental sustainable food system, in which obviously there is livestock? What are the metrics we would need for these different strategies, and how can we adjust these metrics to much better reflect the livestock sector? Well, the strategies for an environmental sustainable livestock in the food system, we found 3 of them in the literature review. We talk about efficiency, consistency, and sufficiency. Efficiency is about improving the ratio of output to input, which is basically saying, how can we produce more by using less resources? And the concepts that relate to efficiency are usually sustainable intensification. So how do we get more livestock out of less resources? This is a concept or narrative we hear quite often. The more efficient you produce, the more sustainable your production. Well, there are 2 other strategies. One is consistency, which is about aligning material and energy flows with natural processes. And the concept that links to livestock would be closing environmental cycles, such as nitrogen cycles, but we can also talk of phosphorus and carbon, which links to this concept of circularity, and more and more also to the concept of agroecology. Sufficiency is about a strategy where we try to reduce or renounce we try to use less material or having a reduction. Well, that's something we hear a lot these days, where we say we should eat less meat or we should consume less animal products, which is basically linking to consumers. Well, I think as such, the reduction of meat is not a purpose on its own. And so I translate sufficiency mainly to say it's about producing livestock within the ecosystem carrying capacity and planetary boundaries. And as long as we are within those carrying capacities, well, it's okay to consume animal-sourced food. So now we want to look at how can we actually measure these 3 strategies. The first is quite simple. Efficiency can be well assessed through life cycle assessment, which is something that is covered in work package 5. And it really measures what we call eco-efficiency. So what's the footprint for 1 kilo of meat or milk? Well, I quote here a paper which I like a lot because it says what it is about. It says that if you use LCA approaches on today's method, you're going to favor high input intensive agricultural system and misrepresent the agroecological ones. And I think Work Package 5 is working very hard on improving those methods, which is one way to address the problem. But the other way could be to just say, well, we need metrics for just to capture other strategies than the efficiency. And it's not just about improving LCA, but maybe it's also about understanding how we can measure these other strategies. The problem here is, well, there's no real methods for that. And that's basically the challenge that we wanted to address in Work Package 6. And so we were proposing to use a territorial approach to assess consistency and sufficiency. And here I represent what I call a livestock scale, so that we start understanding what is a territorial approach. Scales is something where you go from something very detailed, where you can answer the detailed question, and then you can open it up and address different problems, including a broader view. And so defining on which scale you work is very important because it allows you to answer certain questions and not others. And here what we see is the scale on how I understand it when we look at livestock science. At the very bottom, the most detailed studies you can do is about the genome. It's about genetics and breeding. Then we can look at the animal and how it interacts in the herd. That's probably the level at which you can look at animal welfare. What you also see, this genome to herd is basically hardcore livestock science. So I won't say too much because I think it's covered in Work Package 3, and I'm also not very competent about those scales. From the farm scale onwards, you start having humans interacting. So you have farmers that take decision on farms, and at higher scale you start having policies that become important. And so we talk about the territorial landscape, or the territory or landscape, which is this middle scale between the farm and the country, the region and continents. Some people call it territory. In ecology, it's called landscape ecology. It has to do also with languages, so I use both here so that everybody knows what we're talking about. On the side here, you see that I recognize that for other questions, you might have other scales, which would include value chains, but here I really focus on a geographical scale. So why is a territorial approach interesting? It's for two reasons. First, it's the territorial landscape approach is the approach where ecosystem processes that are relevant for agriculture play out. Water flows down from a mountain and it's not bounded to the farm, for example. And so it's really important to have a broader view to capture the ecosystem processes, and therefore, which will also allow us to link to the ecosystem services. The second point is if you move away from the farm to the territory, you don't point at one farmer saying he is not sustainable, but you consider the fact that these farmers could interact and, for example, have an arable farm working together with a livestock farmer. And that's something you cannot capture at the farm level, and something if you go to the country level, which is too detailed, so you can't catch it either. So we really try to work on this territorial scale and going into more geographical modeling. So that's exactly the approach we were proposing as GEO-SoL, where we try to somehow link, and that's what we're working on right now, the impact of livestock to certain pixels. And that's the biggest part of the work we want to do this year, to understand how to allocate impacts of livestock so that we then can link those to ecosystem processes and start computing a nitrogen soil balance, which would be a measure of circularity or consistency, depending on which literature you base yourself on, and the carrying capacities of biomass, water, and also nitrogen that is connected to biodiversity, which are much more the sufficiency measures. Well, we can do this, but that's not very useful because it doesn't allow us to run scenarios, and therefore we propose to hang it, make it as an add-on to what is already existing as the SoL model, which is a mass flow model that allows us to run scenarios in the food system, so that we can say how these new metrics would change as the food system is changing. So, as a conclusion, what we're trying to do is to go beyond efficiency and understand or provide metrics for consistency and sufficiency that are territorial based, in the hope that we will actually provide a broader metrics for the debate on what is sustainable and what is not, once we're going to develop the pathways. And I think that's it from my side. I promise to keep it short.
Thank you, Catherine. Are there any questions or comments? Go ahead, Bill. I see Bill has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you, Danielle. That was very useful summary, Catherine, and I was unfamiliar with your categorization of the different strategies, but having seen it, it makes a lot of sense to me, and it really highlights the problem that we have in trying to present a kind of more strategic food system analysis, when everything in farming today is dominated by the market, and the market focuses on this thing that you started with, which is the efficiency. And I'm a farmer, and you know, I'm living in the real world in that sense, and so I kind of understand those pressures that farmers would be under to maximize efficiency and always go for higher yields. But these other elements of consistency and sufficiency, you know, that's where we're going to have problems getting the right ideas across to farmers and the public, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think that's something which is very important is when we go in a transition, is we're going to have winners and losers, and we're going to have trade-offs. And we need to talk about those. And that's one of the big core topics in this project. But how can you talk about trade-offs if you can't measure and show that it is a trade-off? And I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to enhance the metrics so that the debate about what is a trade-off and who is going to be the winner and the loser and what is society actually willing to accept as a trade-off, and to contribute to that debate through additional metrics.
So if I could just sort of quickly respond to that, because I see the metrics as being part of the problem, and this emphasis by particularly, you know, market-based organizations on life cycle analysis, and here in the UK we have something called Past 2050, and there the metrics are really pointing everything to this question of efficiency and production, and they're not fit for the kind of holistic analysis that we really need. So we have to get the policymakers to choose the right metrics to do these analyses.
But today they can't choose the right metrics because most of them are not there. And I think that's really what Work Package 6 is trying to do, is to find additional metrics so that we enable that debate.
Yes, so perhaps metrics, methodologies then.
Methodologies maybe is a better word, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Then I see Frank and David and Daniel. Are you managing the raised hands? Because I'm sure I won't be able to see it all.
Next was Frank. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. There was two things I just noted. So for the first, I think the what you call territorial is very misleading because it's used in the national climate reporting as defining what is going on the area without import and export. So, so in the national inventories for climate, it is you have the life cycle approach and you have the territorial approach as two contradictions to what do you call it? So I think it's a little misleading. I think geographic would be better if you try to use that. And then the other one was that I don't really understand what you mean by carrying capacity for nitrogen. Could you explain this?
What we are reviewing approaches currently that look at what is called a critical nitrogen load that is coming from the air and goes onto the soils, because we think that this is connected to biodiversity loss. And this is one of the next step we are doing, is to review this literature so that we could have a metrics that links directly emissions from manure to a deposition of nitrogen, and then compare that with a critical nitrogen load and say whether you are within or beyond the threshold that would keep biodiversity, which would not lead to a biodiversity loss. This is something we don't talk about it too loud because we are not so sure it's going to work, but that's something which is on the pipeline for the review in our team.
Maybe I shortly add.
Yes, Adrian,
this.
please.
What I think is important with these metrics is that many of them, because we are working on quite an aggregate level, nevertheless, also if it's landscape and so on, are a type of a risk indicator, whether we run a small, a large, a medium risk to cross certain boundaries. In particular with biodiversity, for example, which is a very, you have so many approaches how to look at biodiversity that it's really difficult to include it in such a model. And there, such risk approaches are quite helpful, which indicate just where a danger may arise and where action is needed for sure or for sure not, and such things.
Want to move on to David? Don't know if there was. Yep, we can go ahead with David then.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Catherine, for very nice overview. I'm trying to think on the work you're going to develop in Work Package 6, and I assume the model is going to be applied at least in a European level across different regions, and I can see, I'm not an expert on this, but I can see many challenges, and I would like to ask you about those. How you're going to deal with that in terms of not only the variety of regions or territories or geographic areas, as Frank said, and the interconnection between the different elements in those ecosystems, but also the differences in the data you might have in terms of how, the depth of knowledge of those data sources, the accuracy that may vary quite substantially across regions, and may also lead to confusion results.
Okay, thanks. That's a really good question. And if I mess it up, I hope that Adrian will really help me. If you work on these higher scales, obviously you need to trade in levels of details. And so we're going to start off a model that uses Eurostat and FADN data and start from there, and then look how and if we can bring in specific information from the regions. And that's something we are currently very hot in the debate in what's going on in this task 3.1, is how are we able to link the farming systems, and Leia is smiling, to this geographical approach. But on the plan C or D, or the worst case for the base, will be homogeneous or consistent data across the whole of Europe to make sure that there's no confusion. And then we'll see if and how we can bring in the information from the specific systems as they will be defined in 3.1.
Thank you.
I hope it helps to understand, or not more confusing than before.
The next question was from Anna.
Yes, hi, Catherine. Very good and clear presentation, I thought. But what I'm struggling with is the connection between the nitrogen load, presumably from the manure, or perhaps the animals themselves, and biodiversity. Could you elaborate a bit more on how do you calculate or estimate that?
I would love to, and would promise to make a new seminar once we reviewed it all. But Switzerland has assessed biodiversity in this way, where there is a map of critical nitrogen load, and that's the big question mark, because that map is not available, was promised for the European Union, but was not released. So we are not sure if we can go that road, but it's basically, there's a map saying how much nitrogen can come from the air to the soil before you pass the threshold, or you're going to lose biodiversity. And this is an existing thing we won't invent ourselves if we find that map. And then we're going to actually measure the contribution, which is the percentage of what can be taken from that area, which comes from livestock. We need to acknowledge that livestock is not the only driver. So we're going to tell you like 20% of what can be taken comes from the livestock sector, or 120%. But we need to acknowledge that nitrogen deposition can also come from cars and from other processes. So we will basically tell you simply, well, livestock contributes to so much of the exhaustion of the nitrogen deposition you can have there. But because we haven't fully reviewed it, don't take my word for it.
Yeah.
But that's an option we're exploring.
Yeah, and that's where surely also the agricultural system must come into play, because if it's a permanent grassland or an open lay system or vegetable growing, intensive vegetable growing that takes care of the manure, all that is going to influence.
Well, de facto, this is included in that map that says how much the nitrogen load can. What's this critical load, and that's dependent on the land cover and the land use, and but as I said, the map hasn't been released, so we are not sure if we can do that or not. But that was the original idea, and if the map hasn't been released, there must be good reasons for that, right?
Okay, we have another question from one of our advisory board members.
Yes, I have one question. So, Jean-Louis. Thanks, Catherine, for the quite interesting presentation. I just wondering, why when you speak about territorial approach or regional approach, if you prefer, why you don't mention you speak about consistency and sufficiency, but we can also speak about efficiency. I'm always surprised that we claim that we increase the efficiency of the livestock sectors using LCA analysis because we improve animal genetics, we improve animal diets, but in the same time, we increase the competition between feed and food, especially for ruminants. Considering the territorial approach, we can think about livestock as a recycler of biomass using non-edible biomass, and we can define new top proxy, new indicators of efficiency at this specific level.
Or would those be measures of consistency?
Well, it could be a measure of crop, for example, cropland use per output would go in this direction. But it's one can capture parts of it via efficiency indicators and others less so. And that's why I think these different approaches are interesting to have. The consistency besides the efficiency, where the consistency, another narrative is to tell or to start with which role is now purely from an economic point of view have animals in such systems. And that's what, as you said, it's converting biomass not useful for humans into high value food. That's the grasslands and the byproducts and the waste and so on. And an efficiency measure would then be the cropland use, which is sort of zero with 100% grassland-based ruminant. So it can go hand in hand, but I think it's important to have this additional level of consistency to be told alongside the efficiency approaches.
And I'm also not sure if you would then get the best efficiency measures. But I will take a note, we might take it in, because once we calculate things, we can easily also do some efficiency measures and then compare with what's coming out from LCA.
And maybe another level where it's important to think about is which is the output unit used. So is it kg of meat or kg of ruminant meat or kg of protein? Or what we tend to favor is the sort of measured over a certain timeline, so meaning also complex crop rotations, including feed elements over a certain region. How much food nutrients do we really produce averaged over this geographical and temporal range? And then you get sort of a more encompassing contribution of the system to food production, which is then again an output per input, so to say, but it's a much more complex way of, so I wouldn't call it directly efficiency. And also if you look at the nutrients, it's then difficult is it fat, is it protein, calories, which type of proteins, how do you aggregate? So we need to somehow keep it on a multidimensional level. And I think there it helps to explicitly not call it or not stick to efficiency approaches or metrics always, which are such relative approaches. And maybe a second thing to add is related to this carrying capacity or globally to greenhouse gas emissions. On a certain level of aggregation, it doesn't matter how much you emit relatively, but it's just total of emissions which matter. And that's why we also tend to argue that we can have in a system sort of climate inefficient grass-fed ruminants, but because their number is much smaller, we have a total greenhouse gas emission which is much lower than we have today, and this would still contribute to climate change mitigation, although it wouldn't be climate efficient.
Okay, we'll need to wrap it up, but maybe one last question or comment from Frank, and then we can close.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I'm the one to. Sorry, can you hear me now? I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm the right person to close, but I would, if it's possible, I would just want to show one slide, because now you're talking really a lot about efficiency, and this is the wrong metrics maybe, but. If you look at if you can see this these graphs here, you can see that that when you see the lower graph, the kilo carbon dioxide per kilo of milk produced, corrected by fat and protein, you can see that it actually, even though the cows may become more efficient when they produce 8,000 and 9,000, actually the climate impact per kilo of milk is not going down anymore. So actually the LCA is already a metrics that's showing this. So we don't have to automatically discard this system, I think. This was just a remark about all the criticism. Yeah.
I think it's a really brilliant closing remark, because I don't think it's about discarding LCA. I mean, it's about finding we need to have efficient systems, but we also need those within planetary boundaries. And it's going to be the combination of several metrics that will allow us to find out what is the most environmental sustainable system. And absolutely not disregarding efficiency, because it's an important strategy. And I will still think LCA is the best method for that.
Yeah, but as said, it also shows that even though you are very efficient in using maybe nutrients and other things, it doesn't give just lower climate impact, because you're using a lot of other resources also. Yeah.
Okay, we'll close here. Thank you, Catherine, and everyone for your questions. The next one, I believe, is the 6th of July. If there is any suggestions for presentations or topics to cover, please get in touch with me. And the next one will be at 12:45, so 12:45 CET. We will now break for the executive board meeting. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.